Welcome to This Week in Christian History, a podcast from the Center for Christian History at Mississippi College. The Center for Christian History is dedicated to expanding knowledge and understanding of Christian history. Our mission is to provide a scholarly, unbiased look at the events, figures, and movements that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. You can visit centerforchristianhistory.com for daily historical highlights. And each week on this podcast, we'll do a deep dive into key moments with Christian history's leading authorities. Our first historical highlight of the week is the first Youth for Christ rally. The rally was held in Chicago at Orchestra Hall on May 27, 1944, 10 days before D-Day. The preacher was Youth for Christ's first full-time staff member, Billy Graham. Graham would go on to be perhaps the most influential Christian apologist of the 20th century. Our next historical highlight and the subject of our deep dive is Joan of Arc. The 100 Years' War between France and England was fought over control of France. Joan from the Orleans district joined the fight against the English because she was convinced that the Archangel Michael told her to do so. She was eventually captured and brought to trial by the local bishop and sentenced to be burned at the stake. Joan shouted the name of Jesus as she took her last breath on May 30th, 1431. She was only 19 years old. 25 years later, Pope Calixtus III had her trial re-examined, and he deemed her an innocent martyr. Joan was canonized as a saint in the Roman Catholic Church in 1909. Our final historical highlight of the week is Reverend Gideon Blackburn. On May 31st, 1803, Presbyterians appointed Blackburn as their first missionary to the American Indians. A flamboyant preacher, he once held the attention of a crowd of 1,500 listeners for 2 hours in a rainstorm. As a missionary and pastor, Blackburn planted churches and schools from Illinois to Alabama over a period of 40 years, working along the western frontier as it moved further across North America. However, it is believed that Blackburn smuggled whiskey and dealt in land speculation, which tarnishes his reputation. Today in our deep dive, Nick Walters, director of the Center for Christian History, talked with Daniel Hobbins of the University of Notre Dame about Joan of Arc.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of This Week in Christian History. We are glad to have as our guest today Dr. Daniel Hobbins, who's an associate professor at Notre Dame. And we are on the subject and the discussion of Joan of Arc. And we are focusing in on her martyrdom and as a way for us to be able to talk about her and who she was and what was important about that. It actually occurred on May the 30th, 1431, if we have the right info in front of us to do that. Does that sound like about the right time frame, Dr. Hobbins?
Yeah, it's either May 30 or 31. I think.
Oh, okay.
I'll take your word for 31. But yeah,
well, we're gonna go with
right
what happened this week. Okay, at least we'll just go with that of the week that we're focusing in on. So, tell us a little bit. We certainly want to know a little bit more about Joan of Arc and who she was and kind of her story about the things that we know, and as well as things that we probably, like most historians, there are some things we know, we think we know. There are other things that we think we know, right, based off of whatever information is there. But it seems to me that the background of the 100 Years' War is really kind of important for us to understand in context of that. So maybe we could kick off with just some kind of a primer of that, maybe? Would that be okay?
Sure, yeah. So 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453. It's really more like a series of campaigns. You wouldn't think of it as kind of consistent war. There could be many years of truce in between these, fought between England and France and actually Burgundy, which is no longer, ceased to be became part of France in the late 15th century. So we forget about that. England and France, of course, can continue as nation states. So it's mostly fought in France. And for the first part of the 100 Years' War, nearly all of the victories are English. And now these were campaigns that took place, as I said, in France. And what would happen is the English king would usually go on campaign for a few months, then some victory would happen for the English, prisoners would be taken, and the English would go back home. And then in the truce England would get maybe control of more land, but English troops weren't actually occupying France, and that we wouldn't think of it as exactly as a territorial war in a modern sense.
Mm.
This changes, however, with Henry V, who becomes King of England in 1413, and he settles down to the business of actually trying to occupy France. And his great victory happens in 1415 at the Battle of Agincourt. That's famous from Shakespeare's play. And that's a disaster for France. And on top of so now northern France and then a few years later, even Paris comes under English Burgundian control. The Burgundians, that's another part of this. Now the Burgundians are actually allying after 1418. The Burgundians are allying with England. And so you have this Anglo-Burgundian alliance. A French king since 1392, Charles VI, who is uh, incompetent because he actually endures for months at a time. He'll have bouts of madness where he's completely incapable of ruling. And so there's now a power vacuum. And then he'll have periods of lucidity as well. But so you have the combination of really effective English rulers, really incompetent French rulers, and his reign lasts for a very long time. He doesn't die, Charles VI, I mean, King of France, doesn't die until 1422. And then he's succeeded by the Dauphin, as Joan calls him, Charles VII. So when Joan comes along, the Hundred Years' War is at a really dark period for France, where England is allied to Burgundy, and Burgundy is a major, major player, very wealthy. All these northern industrial towns that produce a lot of wealth. Its capital at Dijon in what we think of today as France, but it's not contiguous. Burgundy is not contiguous. It's both in part of in modern France and then part of in the Low Countries. So by 1429, Charles VII, the Dauphin, is faced with a situation where the English are now besieging Orleans, on the Loire. And if that falls, the whole Loire Valley will fall. And Charles VII was actually considering abandoning France entirely and leaving the country and trying to almost like a situation with de Gaulle in the Second World War or something, where although he was no de Gaulle, let's be clear about that. He was not a very effective ruler. And so this is the situation that Joan faces when she arrives at court, or that France faces. And so a very dark period in French history. The Hundred Years' War had been, up until that point, pretty much a series of English victories. And then looking ahead, Joan's victories we can kind of, we can get to the punchline right after Joan's victories. Then that arguably turns the tide of the war, and it doesn't happen all at once, but the French recovery then begins. Paris is recovered, I think, in 1436, and then by 1453, after certain improvements in siege engines and artillery, the French eventually push England completely out of France, with only Calais being remaining English territory. And that then generates with England, that kind of launches kind of recriminations over this failure, which leads to the Wars of the Roses,
Gotcha.
again famous for English history. So that's a kind of geopolitical background for Joan.
Yeah. Well, we don't have to go all the way down this rabbit hole.
Right.
But the whole thing, I mean, I would say anybody that has just kind of a rudimentary understanding or a comprehension of history, European history, understands there's the go back and forth between France and England, however you kind of define the countries and what they might have looked like and who was in charge. they've been going on for such a long period of time that was not,
Right.
it's not like this was a new story, right, on
No,
anybody.
no, that's right.
If you
Really
go all the way
dates.
back to William the Conqueror and kind of,
That's right.
I'm French and yeah,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
no, I'm English, but no, I'm English and you're still part of my France, or
yeah. That's
some of
right.
that.
William is Duke of Normandy and then becomes King of England. So he's King of England, but vassal to the King of France. So he has the English have all these, then English kings have these continental land holdings. And that's the ultimate or the deep background, the deep origin of the Hundred Years' War.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, very cool. So let's talk about Joan then, and let's
Right.
talk about this battle at Orleans and what that really was about, or the conflict, I guess we should say,
Yeah.
about how it built towards that. So it was a linchpin of what I'm hearing you say is that, look, if it fell, the what was going to be left of France, or what they had to contend with, was going to probably be very decisive and very, very impactful for them on
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's what happens if the English take Orleans? It's dire. It's really a very dark situation. England, Orleans is under siege. Although the French are still able to supply the city, but it's not going to last much longer. And so she shows up in February at the court which is meeting, being held. The royal court is at Chinon, in Angevin territory, and she shows up there and asks for an army to go relieve the city and defeat the English. I mean, she sees things in very black and white terms. She's not thinking about, pardon me, she doesn't think about diplomacy. That eventually becomes her undoing. Whereas would have been later on, after these victories, there would be some in the French court who would then say, okay, that's great. That victory is great. Joan, great job, Joan. Now step aside and let's negotiate, right? And she doesn't that's not part of her vocabulary. She's a simple peasant girl and wants to, see again, headstrong, wants to take the army and attack. Anyway, when she arrives at court, Charles, realizing that that someone who comes with a claim to divine revelation, that someone like that, this is not unprecedented, um, for uh, for women. In fact, it's often women to come to the court and claim to have revelation from God, and it might be the message might vary. It usually wasn't this sort of political message. Sometimes it had to do with resolving the great schism, the fact that you have two different popes with obediences in various parts of Europe. But Charles realizes that when someone says there's revelation, they're claiming to speak on God's behalf, they have to be vetted, because maybe, in fact, the voice in their head is actually uh, from somewhere infernal, so to speak, instead of from a heavenly voice. And so he has her examined by his theologians, and that happens for 3 weeks. We don't have a record of that. Unfortunately, there was a record, it was lost. And then she's approved. She comes back, and he basically sort of gives her an army. She's not the general. She's with the army. She's very much on the front lines, carrying a banner and riding a horse, and she's sent to relieve the city with this army, and arrives in the end of April, and by May 8th, counter to all sort of human expectation, the siege is broken, and the English, instead of fighting, decide to fight another day, and they retreat. Now, what this bare account doesn't capture is the sort of expectation in the French camp for Joan. She was known. People knew about Joan even before she arrived at the battlefield. Word had spread, rumors um, of this maid, as she was called, Pucelle in French. And so when this victory happens, this is seen as proof of her divine mission in the French camp. And there is euphoria of a kind that's very uncommon, I think. For with looking back, our sources you have to read sort of against the grain of the sources sometimes, but they do communicate that there's a euphoria, and this catches fire, and then a string of victories, all the way leading to July, from May 8th to July, a series of victories over, often it was just French towns under English control that are just, or fortresses or cities that are just opening their gates to the French army. And then Charles is crowned in July. And that's the crowning moment, and the high watermark for Joan.
You can watch the rest of Nick's interview with Daniel Hobbins on the Center for Christian History website at centerforchristianhistory.com. This Week in Christian History is produced for the Center for Christian History by Blue and Gold Media at Mississippi College, in cooperation with the MC Department of Communication. For episode transcripts and more information, visit centerforchristianhistory.com. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, YouTube Music, or wherever fine podcasts are found. Our next episode is coming next week. Thank you for listening.